In the mid-1970s, California was a state in transition. Suburbs were booming. Families were moving into quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods, and a sense of peace seemed to rest over communities north of Sacramento. But beneath that calm surface, something far darker was about to unfold. Something that would turn ordinary homes into hunting grounds. It began with whispers of break-ins, prowlers seen darting through backyards, and phone calls where no one spoke on the other end of the line. At first, no one could have predicted that these strange disturbances were early signs of a predator who would become one of the most notorious criminals in American history. By June 1976, the whispers grew into headlines. In Rancho Cordova, a young woman was attacked in her own home by a masked intruder. He wore gloves, carried a flashlight, and moved with a chilling confidence. He bound the victim with shoelaces, stole small personal items, and then vanished into the night. Weeks later, another victim, then another. Law enforcement realized they were facing a serial offender. But what unsettled investigators most was the precision of his methods. He had studied his victims, learned their routines, and struck when they were most vulnerable. The press dubbed him the East Area Rapist. As the months passed, his pattern became terrifyingly clear. He selected middle-class neighborhoods, often targeting homes with easy escape routes, such as bike paths or creeks nearby. Before his attacks, he stalked his victims, peering through windows, leaving doors unlocked, and sometimes calling them on the phone. Survivors remembered those calls. Heavy breathing, soft whispers, or sometimes a chilling promise that he would be back. He seemed to enjoy psychological warfare as much as the assaults themselves. By the end of 1976, the number of attacks had already climbed into double digits, and communities were paralyzed by fear. What made him even more terrifying was his escalation. Many of his earliest attacks targeted women who were alone, but it wasn't long before he began striking at couples. He would break into homes where a husband and wife were sleeping, tie up the man, and place dishes on his back, warning that if a single plate fell while he assaulted the wife, he would kill them both. This tactic was as cruel as it was effective. It immobilized the men and magnified the trauma of the women. His victims later described the terror of lying helpless, listening to him whisper threats in the dark, convinced death was a moment away. By 1977 and 1978, the East Area Rapist had become a household name in Northern California. Neighborhoods changed overnight. Families bought guard dogs, installed double locks, and armed themselves with baseball bats and guns. Community meetings filled gymnasiums as police tried to reassure the public. But fear lingered like a shadow. Some women slept with friends rather than alone, while men patrolled their backyards, shotguns in hand. Suburban California, once thought to be safe, was now a landscape of paranoia. Despite massive efforts, law enforcement struggled to keep up. Detectives from multiple counties formed task forces, comparing notes and sharing evidence. But the attacker was always one step ahead. He left almost nothing behind. He wore gloves to avoid fingerprints, moved silently through homes, and slipped away before police could arrive. Investigators began to suspect he had law enforcement or military training because of his discipline and tactical precision. Without DNA technology and with no solid leads, every investigation seemed to hit a wall. For survivors, the trauma was lifelong. Many later testified that the attacks left them with nightmares, broken marriages, and an unshakable sense of dread. What haunted them most wasn't just the violence. It was the image of a man who seemed to vanish into the night, never caught, never punished. To them, he wasn't just an attacker. He was a phantom that lived in the shadows of their memories. By the end of the decade, the East Area Rapist had committed more than 50 sexual assaults across Northern California. His crimes stretched across Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, and beyond. Each case had its own horrors, but together they painted a picture of a predator who was both methodical and sadistic. Still, no one realized that this wave of terror was only the beginning. He was about to evolve into something far deadlier. The story of the Golden State Killer would not stop with rape and burglary. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the East Area Rapist would transform into the original Night Stalker, leaving behind not just victims, but corpses. The suburban phantom was about to become a full-fledged killer, and California had no idea that the worst was yet to come. By the late 1970s, the attacks in Northern California seemed to stop. Newspapers went quiet, neighborhood watch groups dissolved, and residents allowed themselves to believe that the East Area Rapist had disappeared. Maybe he had been caught for another crime. Maybe he had moved to a different state. Or maybe he had simply grown tired of his spree. But in reality, he had not stopped. He had evolved. In 1979, a chilling new crime shattered the illusion of peace. In Goleta, near Santa Barbara, a young couple was attacked in their home. The scene was both familiar and more brutal than ever before. The victims had been bound, but this time, the intruder did not leave them alive. They were bludgeoned to death. The precision, the bindings, the quiet entry. Detectives who had studied the East Area Rapist pattern immediately recognized the similarities. But now, he was not just a rapist. He was a killer. A new name spread across California, the original Night Stalker. Over the next several years, the killings multiplied. The man who once taunted police and terrified women in Sacramento now left a trail of corpses across Southern California. From Ventura to Irvine, couples are found dead in their homes, bound with shoelaces or cords. The murders had a haunting ritualistic pattern. Entry through sliding doors or windows, bindings taken from the victim's own belongings, and bludgeoning or stabbing that reflected both rage and control. Unlike many killers driven by impulse, the original Night Stalker seemed coldly deliberate. He prepared his attacks, escaped without a trace, and often left communities confused about whether they were facing one monster or many. One of the most infamous cases came in 1980 with the murder of Charlene and Lyman Smith in Ventura. Lyman was an attorney rumored to be on track for a judgeship, and Charlene was described by friends as vibrant and kind. They were found bound and bludgeoned to death in their bedroom. Their home turned into a crime scene of unimaginable violence. The brutality shocked investigators, not just because of the savagery, but because it seemed so calculated. The attacker had controlled the victims, carried out his assault, and disappeared as though he had evaporated into thin air. What made the original Night Stalker so terrifying was his unpredictability. While he usually targeted couples, some victims were killed while alone. In 1981, a single woman named Manuela Withun was murdered in Irvine while her husband was in the hospital. The killer bound her, assaulted her, and left her dead in her home. Once again, the entry method, the bindings, and the clinical approach all echoed the East Area Rapist style. But investigators at the time failed to connect the crimes. The rapes in Northern California and the murders in the South were treated as separate cases. It would take decades before DNA evidence revealed the truth, that they were the same man. Throughout the early 1980s, the killings continued. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta, Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point. Janelle Cruz, just 18 years old, was murdered in her Irvine home in 1986, bludgeoned to death while her family was away. Janelle's murder would later be remembered as his last known killing. But at the time, police were overwhelmed. They had little evidence, no clear suspect, and a growing list of victims. Entire communities lived in fear, locking doors and windows, sleeping with weapons nearby, and second-guessing every creak in the night. The psychology of the killer fascinated and frustrated investigators. His earlier crimes as an East Area Rapist revealed a need for power and control. His whispers, his threats, his manipulation of victims, all spoke to a sadistic personality who thrived on fear. As the original Night Stalker, that sadism escalated into murder. Some experts believe he killed to silence witnesses. Others suggest that killing gave him a greater thrill than the assaults ever had. Whatever his motive, his crimes carried a terrifying message. No home was safe, and no couple was beyond his reach. Law enforcement poured resources into catching him. In Sacramento, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Orange County, task forces were formed, evidence was examined, and thousands of suspects were interviewed. Yet time and again, the case went cold. Without modern DNA tools, detectives could not connect the crimes definitively. To many officers, he was a ghost, a faceless predator who slipped through cracks in the system. Retired investigators later admitted that the failure to capture him weighed heavily on them for decades. For families of the victims, the pain was immeasurable. Parents buried children, Children grew up without parents, and loved ones were left with questions that would not be answered for nearly 40 years. They lived in the shadow of a faceless murderer, haunted by the knowledge that he was still out there, perhaps living a normal life, perhaps blending into their very neighborhoods. By 1986, the murders abruptly stopped. There were no more assaults, no more reports of a masked intruder breaking into homes. The trail went cold. Some believed he had died. Others thought he had been imprisoned for another crime. But the truth was simpler and far more unnerving. He had simply stopped, retreating into the ordinary life of a man who looked like anyone else. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker had left behind a legacy of at least 13 murders and more than 50 rapes. His crime spanned a decade in 2 regions of California, but his identity remained unknown. For years, he was nothing more than a list of monikers: the ER, the ONS, the Diamond Knot Killer. Only much later would the world realize they were all the same man, the one who would finally be known as the Golden State Killer. After 1986, the murders suddenly stopped. California, though still shaken, began to heal. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, whoever he was, seemed to have disappeared. Police task forces slowed down, newspapers stopped printing updates, and families of victims were left in agonizing limbo. For the next 3 decades, the faceless predator lived only in whispers, unsolved files, and the nightmares of those who remembered him. Survivors aged, detectives retired, and communities that once locked their doors every night tried to move forward. But the shadow of the unknown still loomed. The unanswered question was simple: where had he gone? In reality, the man behind the mask had simply melted back into ordinary life. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He had once worked as a police officer, which explained his tactical precision and knowledge of law enforcement procedures. After leaving the force, he lived quietly in a Sacramento suburb, married, raised children, and worked for years as a mechanic at a grocery distribution center. Neighbors described him as grumpy and reclusive, but no one imagined he was a sadistic predator. For decades, he blended into society, hiding in plain sight, carrying away his crimes while the world forgot his name. Meanwhile, technology was catching up. In the 1990s, DNA testing became a powerful tool for linking crimes. Samples preserved from the original Night Stalker murders confirmed that the same man had committed multiple homicides across Southern California. Later, in the early 2000s, investigators made a groundbreaking discovery. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. This revelation shocked even seasoned detectives. The rapist of Sacramento and the killer of Irvine were one man, a predator who had terrorized the state for a decade under different names. From that moment forward, he would be called the Golden State Killer. Despite the DNA connections, his identity remained a mystery. Investigators had a genetic fingerprint, but no face to match it to. Countless suspects were tested and cleared. Families of victims gathered for press conferences year after year, begging for answers, but the trail remained cold. Many wondered if the killer had died or would never be identified. For survivors, the lack of closure was a wound that never healed. Everything changed in 2018. Using a relatively new technique called genetic genealogy, detectives uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy website. From there, they traced family trees, narrowing down possible relatives and building out branches until one name surfaced: Joseph James DeAngelo. Surveillance teams collected the scarred item. Some reports say a tissue, others a piece of trash, and tested against crime scene DNA. The results were conclusive. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had finally been unmasked. On April 24th, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old, a retired grandfather, living a quiet suburban life. Neighbors watched in disbelief as police swarmed his property. To many, he was the man who tinkered with cars in his driveway, the man who yelled at neighbors about his lawn, but nothing more. To investigators, he was a monster they had been chasing for a lifetime. His arrest made national headlines, hailed as one of the greatest breakthroughs in criminal justice history. The courtroom that followed became a stage for decades of pain. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and admitted to dozens of rapes, though the statute of limitations prevented formal charges on most of the assaults. During sentencing, survivors and victims' family confronted him directly. Some spoke through tears, others with anger, but all carried the weight of what he had taken from them. In a faint, raspy voice, DeAngelo broke his silence only once, whispering, "I admit." For the first time, the Phantom acknowledged his crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his age, it was effectively a death sentence. For families, it was not complete healing. No punishment could erase the horrors of the past, but it was closure. After decades of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions, the Golden State Killer finally had a name, a face, and a prison cell. Joseph James DeAngelo now spends his remaining days in a California prison, far removed from the suburban streets he once stalked. His story stands as a chilling reminder of how one man, living a double life, was able to terrorize an entire state and evade capture for over 40 years. Yet it is also a story of perseverance, of detectives who never gave up, of survivors who found the strength to speak, and of science that finally brought the truth to light. The Golden State Killer left behind a legacy of fear, but also a powerful lesson. No matter how much time passes, justice has a way of catching up. For California, the nightmare ended not with his crimes, but with his capture. And for the world, his name remains etched in history. Not as a fan in the shadows, but as a man unmasked, a killer finally held accountable after decades of terror.